Welcome back to Raising Jackson. This post will be about our story and basically from 5 or 6 weeks through to today currently. There's quite a lot to get through. I have a chart. So there is quite a lot to get through, so I will move quite quickly. As I've said in the previous video, I will go back and go into some of these topics more in depth. But for now, I just thought I'd do like a quick overhaul on our experience and what we sort of did, where we were sort of dismissed and where we really found help along the way. So at about 5 weeks, I noticed that he was vomiting excessively, and I just assumed that he may have picked up a virus. And as it was the weekend, I took him to the ED, and we were there for around 8 hours, and they sort of diagnosed us with feeding problems and said to follow up with a pediatrician. They did all these other checks, and he didn't have a fever, he didn't have anything else, so they just said it's most likely just a feeding issue, vomiting, that sort of thing. So at 7 weeks, I was in with the pediatrician, and he prescribed Gaviscon. So at this point, he was currently on the 70th percentile. He was born quite a chubby bubby. And I'd followed up with, maternal child health nurses and stuff like that, because his sleep was so bad. Like, he was waking up every 45 minutes, and feeding consistently, but also then vomiting consistently. So we sort of went through this over and over again with the child health nurses and the pediatrician, up until he was about 20 weeks old. And at this point, I had taken him to a few GPs also because of the vomiting and just the general disinterest in feeding. It had already started. So we were told that due to my husband and myself being tall and I guess a bit lean, that it was most likely that he was just correcting his curve. They weren't particularly concerned that he had dropped to the 40th percentile at this point. And they also said, as he was a very active baby, that it's fairly normal for babies to lose a little bit of weight. I got a little bit disheartened at that point because I was pretty sure something was going horribly wrong. But he presented so well at any sort of pediatrician appointment. Like, he was always very alert, very interactive, and meeting his milestones well ahead of time. So they didn't really take on board what I was saying. I guess at that point I hadn't started taking videos and I hadn't started a journal, and they just sort of dismissed me as a first-time mum. So I know that's a problem with a lot of parents getting help out there. They're just sort of dismissed. So it got significantly worse between 4 and 6 months. By 6 months, he was acting out. The pediatrician had asked us to start solids with him early, and at first he loved them, and then he little by little just refused them as well. So we followed up again with new GPs and just several visits, and again they all said, oh, he presents very well, he's very healthy, milestones are great, that sort of thing. So I was quite worried, and I went to maternal child health nurse appointment, and I'd been quite upset that day because he hadn't ate or drink he hadn't eaten any solids or drank any milk for probably the whole day. And she said, well, just children can be difficult. They want to be up, they want to be seeing the world. Try a relaxed feeding plan. And by this time he was biting me as well and swatting at me, so he was only really feeding when he was asleep, when I was able to dream feed him. So she said, try a relaxed feeding plan and basically leave the food in front of him. And if he eats it, he eats it. And if he doesn't, it doesn't matter. And usually children take about 3 days to come around to this. And, if he's not coming around to it, then maybe seek further help. But usually within 3 days, they come around to the whole eating process. This was terrible advice. So after those 3 days, he again had just continued to refuse to eat, and we ended up at the ED for dehydration. And I think people started taking notice a little bit then, because he was starting to look particularly lean. So I think by that point he was down to the 15th percentile. And I mean, at home, I was just watching him deteriorate so quickly and doing everything in my power to actually get him to consume, be it water, because the GP had recommended syringing hydrolyte and water. We were in the middle of summer, so syringing hydrolyte and water. He wasn't a fan of this. So yeah, we kept going. I think we presented another time at the hospital for dehydration again, before we got back to see the pediatrician again, who then diagnosed him with failure to thrive. So I guess for any parent that has received that diagnosis, it's almost like a failure to parent. But again, because he was presenting so well, they weren't particularly worried that he had an oral aversion. The pediatrician said, look, he may have developed that, particularly since I had just kept persisting with him with the feeding. They said, yeah, it's likely that is possible, and he recommended us to an OT. And the OT, we ended up seeing her privately. She is part of the feeding team at the Children's Hospital in Brisbane, and I ended up seeing her privately. And she was wonderful, gave us some really great techniques for young children, but the issue still remained of the vomiting. Like every time he ate, he vomited. And I couldn't understand why no one thought that was unusual. So this continued on and on and on, and by this point I was getting very, very desperate. And our quality of life at home was he was just miserable all the time, and no one wants to see their child that miserable all the time, despite their best efforts to keep them content. So they recommended that we go for a 3-week admission to a feeding clinic. At this point, I believe he was on the 3rd percentile, so he'd lost a significant amount of weight. He was starting to look quite gaunt. His little hands, where he had like little chubby fingers when he opened where his knuckles were, like the little dimples, they completely disappeared. His hands were bone thin. And so I agreed. I read reviews, and my OT wasn't particularly on board with the Ellen Barron method. But at this point I was so desperate, and they were the only ones willing to offer any form of help. And my new GP at that time had said, well, look, it's a gateway to getting you the help you need. So I decided to go with the admission, and my GP had also recommended that we start reflux medication. He said, has anyone spoken to you about reflux medication? And I said, no, not at this point. And so I did see some results with the reflux medication. I did see he was slightly more comfortable, but most of the time he was still, up 8 times a night screaming in pain. So at Ellen Barron, I had read some reviews, and then obviously I'd had a chat with our OT, and we discussed a whole range of things, because I could sort of see what was coming. I could see that it was quite likely at this rate that we would have to consider tube feeding. And she sort of said, look, he does have drive, he does have the capacity to eat. And she said, while ever you have that, work so hard. And and we did continue to do that, because in the back of my mind, I just sort of thought tube feeding is not, it's a band-aid. And if it came to it, that was an option, but it wasn't going to address why these things were occurring. And ultimately, that's what I wanted to get to the bottom of, is why these things were occurring, because you're never gonna fix the overall problem if you just keep putting band-aids on it. So at Ellen Barron, I wrote them a letter ahead of time, and I outlined what my concerns were with their methods, and I was assured that that's not how they operate. And I got there, and it was very much how they operate. So I went in knowing what I would and wouldn't take part in. Like, I wouldn't take part in starving him and then leaving 3 hours and then feeding him. Like, I wouldn't do that, because at this point he was about 9 months, and they were, you know, saying like he could go without breast milk at this point. Like, you could supplement with a formula. And I said, well, he won't take a bottle, he won't take a sippy cup, he won't take a drink. Like, even if he sips it with a drink, like, nothing is getting in. And so the first week, I basically showed them what we were doing at home, and the pediatrician at the time was like, no, you know, you have to trust these nurses, they do this for a living. And I'd become so, I guess, distrusting, just because we'd been let down so many times by every other medical professional that we had seen, and I guess dismissed, and a lot of the stuff that they were saying, well, we're going to try this. And I said, well, we have already tried it and it doesn't work. Like, so the second week he sort of said, look, unless you get on board with this program, your child will be tube fed within a month. And so I thought, okay, what do I have to lose? And we did it their way, and we had a closing meeting with the pediatrician and the head nurse at the end of the week. And he had not improved. He'd gotten so much worse. He'd barely slept since we were there. Because they had recommended that I give him either heavy dairy products, so custards made with cream, calorie dense foods, that sort of thing, milk in his cereal. And I had already expressed my concerns that I thought he was perhaps dairy intolerant. And if I wasn't going to give dairy, that I needed to supplement with soy. So again, the second week we tried all these things, and the wheels really came off. At the closing meeting of that week, I sat them both down and I said, I need you to tell me that you have no idea what to do in this situation, that you have no idea how to help my son, because you obviously don't. Your methods, they're for maybe a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. They're not for a 9-month-old. That child isn't doing it to spite me. He isn't doing it because he wants a toy or a car or a sticker. He's doing it because he's in pain. And the only way that he knows how to fight the process is to avoid doing it. So ultimately what I learned is kids who are scared of being hurt won't eat, and kids won't eat what hurts them. So that's what we sort of took away from that, and we didn't bother with the third week. I didn't think that it was going to help anyone at that point.